Welcome back, criminophiles, to another episode of Homicide Cases. I'm your host, Misfit.
I'm Amy Archer-Gilligan, an American serial killer with 5 known victims, but I was suspected of 60.
Socio-legal and forensic analysis of the Archer home homicides, the case of Amy Archer-Gilligan and the genesis of elder care regulation in Connecticut.
The emergence of private elder care in the early 20th century was a direct response to shifting demographic realities in New England, yet it preceded any robust regulatory oversight. This systemic vacuum facilitated one of the most prolific serial murder cases in American history, the operations of Amy Archer-Gilligan at the Archer Home for the Elderly and Infirmed in Windsor, Connecticut. Operating under the guise of a charitable, pious caretaker, Archer-Gilligan utilized the absence of institutional monitoring to implement a business model that incentivized the premature expiration of her residence. The following analysis examines the biographical, financial, forensic, and legal facets of the case, detailing how the murder factory at 37 Prospect Street ultimately necessitated a total transformation of Connecticut's legislative approach to the care of the elderly and established enduring precedents in the admissibility of evidence regarding unchanged misconduct.
The Duggan lineage and the genesis of a caretaker.
The psychological and social foundations of Amy Archer-Gilligan, born Amy E. Dugan, are inextricably linked to the modest and often tumultuous circumstances of her upbringing in Milton, Connecticut. While records fluctuate attributing her birth to either 1868 or 1873, she was the eighth of 10 children born to James Dugan and Mary Kennedy. The Dugan family history was shadowed by severe mental health challenges, an observation of significant relevance to forensic historians. Amy's brother, John Dugan, was committed to the Connecticut General Hospital for the Insane in 1902, and subsequent census data from 1930 confirms that one of her sisters were also institutionalized within the same facility. This genetic and environmental backdrop of institutionalization likely informed Amy's later familiarity with and eventual incarceration within the state's psychiatric infrastructure. Amy Dugan's formal education included attendance at the Milton School and later the New Britain Normal School in 1890, suggesting a level of literacy and social ambition that distinguished her from many of her contemporaries in rural Connecticut. In 1896 or 1897 by varying accounts, she married James Archer. The birth of their daughter, Mary J. Archer, in December 1897 seemingly solidified the family unit, yet the economic pressure of supporting a child in the early 1900s soon redirected the couple towards the nascent field of domestic caretaking. In 1901, the Archers moved to Newington, Connecticut to serve as live-in caretakers for John Seymour, a frail and elderly widower. This arrangement established the template for Amy's professional life, providing domestic stability for the infirmed in exchange for room, board, and eventually the legacy of the property itself. Following the death of John Seymour in 1904, the Archers did not vacate the premises, but instead transitioned from employees to business owners. They rented the Seymour residence from his heirs and established Sister Amy's Nursing Home for the Elderly. The adoption of the title Sister was a calculated semiotic choice, imbuing Amy with a quasi-religious authority and a veneer of nursing professionalism, despite her lack of formal vows or medical licensure. This persona proved highly effective in recruiting residents from local parishes, as Amy was a regular churchgoer and a contributor to various charitable funds.
The move to Windsor and the Archer home infrastructure.
In 1907, a pivotal shift occurred when the Seymour heirs sold the Newington property, forcing the Archers to seek a permanent location for their business. Utilizing their accumulated savings, they purchased a substantial red brick residence located at 37 Prospect Street in Windsor Center. This facility was christened the Archer Home for Elderly People and Chronic Invalids. The location was strategically chosen. Windsor was an area of growth with its population doubling between 1870 and 1920 as younger generations migrated toward urban centers for industrial opportunities, leaving behind an aging population in need of care. The Archers aggressively marketed their services through local newspaper advertisements and postcards, successfully positioning the home as a dignified alternative to state-run poor farms. The internal management of the home appeared to outside observers to be a model of New England charity. Residents were often referred to as inmates, a common term for those in institutional care at the time, and Archer-Gilligan was frequently seen providing tonics and meals to her patients, an act that neighbors interpreted as evidence of her compassionate nature.
Financial predation and the life care conflict of interest.
The operational viability of the Archer home was predicated on two distinct financial models: a standard weekly fee and a more enticing life care contract. The weekly fees ranged from $7 to $25, which provided a steady but modest income. However, it was the life care option, requiring a lump sum payment of $1,000, equivalent to approximately $26,000 to $30,000 in modern currency, that created a lethal conflict of interest. Under a life care contract, the proprietor received a full payment up front in exchange for a promise to care for the resident until their death. Economically, this model meant that a resident's longevity was a direct liability to the business. The sooner a resident died, the higher the profit margin for the proprietor. The financial pressure on Amy Archer-Gilligan intensified significantly following the death of James Archer in 1910. Official records attributed his death to Bright's disease, a common diagnosis for kidney failure at the time, though investigators later noted that Amy had taken out a life insurance policy on him just weeks prior to his passing. James's death left Amy as a widow with a 12-year-old daughter, Mary, whose education became a primary financial burden. Mary was enrolled as a student at the Campbell School for Girls in Windsor, with annual tuition and fees totaling approximately $460, a significant sum for a single proprietor.
The 1911 tax dispute and escalating debt.
The financial strain is evidenced in a 1911 letter from Amy Archer to the Windsor tax collector Howard L. Gosley, in which he disputed back taxes, claiming she was unaware of the debt and citing her husband's recent death as a mitigating factor. This correspondence highlights a period of acute financial instability. During this same window, the mortality rate at the Archer home began to climb sharply. Between 1907 and 1910, while James was alive, the home recorded 12 deaths, a number consistent with a small facility for the elderly. However, between 1911 and 1916, the number of deaths has surged to 48. The correlation between Amy's financial needs and resident turnover is a recurring theme in the investigative analysis. Relatives of the deceased later reported a pattern in which residents would give Amy large sums of money or sign over insurance policies shortly before their sudden decline. This predatory behavior extended beyond borders to her own domestic life, as seen in her brief second marriage. case of Michael Gilligan is particularly illustrative of the overlap between domestic and professional predation. In late 1913, Amy married Gilligan, a 56-year-old widower with 4 adult sons and significant assets. Amy reportedly falsified her age on the marriage license to appear younger, a deceptive tactic that mirrored her professional misrepresentations. Only 3 months after the wedding, in February 1914, Gilligan was found dead. The official cause was listed as valvular heart disease and acute bilious attack. Amy presented a will that left his entire estate, valued at over $4,000, to her. Forensic investigators later determined this was a forgery, likely written in Amy's own hand.
The investigation, Nellie Pierce, and the Fourth Estate.
The longevity of the murder factory was largely enabled by the social standing of the victims and a lack of state oversight. Most boarders were elderly, infirmed, and had few close relatives living nearby. Franklin R. Andrews, however, did not fit this profile. A 60-year-old man who, despite being somewhat crippled, was active enough to perform chores and garden for the home. Andrews maintained a close and frequent correspondence with his family. In May 1914, Andrews spent a day painting the fence around the Archer property, appearing to be in robust health. He collapsed that evening and was dead within 48 hours, with his death attributed to gastric ulcer. Nellie Pierce, Andrews' sister, was unconvinced by the suddenness of his decline. While cleaning out his effects, she discovered letters from Amy Archer-Gilligan relentlessly pressing her brother for money, specifically regarding a $500 loan he had provided her. Pierce brought these concerns to the local district attorney, who initially showed little interest, presumably viewing the death of a 60-year-old in a nursing home as unremarkable. Undeterred, Pierce took her evidence to the Hartford Courant.
Investigative journalism and data comparisons.
The Hartford Courant assigned reporters to investigate the Archer home, spearheaded by resident Windsor correspondent Carlin Gosley. Gosley, who wrote the obituaries for local residents, had already noticed the suspicious frequency of deaths at the home. The ensuing investigation was a masterpiece of early 20th century data journalism. Reporters reviewed years of Windsor death certificates and compared them to the records of the Jefferson Street home for the elderly in Hartford. The comparison revealed a stark statistical anomaly. While the number of deaths at both facilities were similar, the Jefferson Street home had 7 times the population of the Archer home. This established that the death rate at the Archer home was mathematically impossible to attribute to natural causes alone. Furthermore, the reporters noted a consistent pattern in recorded causes of death. Almost all were attributed to stomach pathologies or sudden death, both of which are hallmark indicators of poisoning. The Courant's findings were published on May 9, 1916, under the headline Archer Home for Aged, a Murder Factory. This public exposure galvanized the state's authorities, leading to a comprehensive police investigation and the exhumation of several bodies to secure forensic proof.
The science of poisoning.
The central forensic challenge in the Archer-Gilligan case was the difference between intentional poisoning and the presence of chemicals used in the embalming process. In 1916, embalmers often used arsenic-based fluids to preserve remains. However, the state police, upon exhuming the bodies of Michael Gilligan, Franklin Andrews, Alice Gowdy, Charles Smith, and Maud Howard Lynch, focused on the specific concentrations of the anatomical location of the toxins. Toxicologists found that Franklin Andrews' stomach contained enough arsenic to kill a half a dozen strong men. a concentration that could not be explained by post-mortem seepage from embalming fluids. Similar traces of arsenic or strychnine were discovered in remains of the other four exhumed residents. The use of both arsenic and strychnine suggested a deliberate selection of poisons to simulate various natural ailments, such as heart failure from strychnine or severe gastric distress from arsenic.
The poison register audits.
To back up the toxicological findings, investigators turned to the poison register that Connecticut law required all drugstores to maintain. Carlin Gosley discovered that Amy Archer-Gilligan had been a frequent purchaser of arsenic at the W.H.H. Mason's drugstore on the Broad Street Green in Windsor. In the second week of February 1914, coinciding with the death of her second husband, she purchased 10 ounces of arsenic, a volume sufficient to kill over 100 people. Amy's defense for these purchases was that the home was plagued by an infestation of rats and bedbugs. However, the investigation revealed she had occasionally sent her own boarders to the pharmacy to purchase a poison, and on other occasions she had local doctors like Dr. King sign a register on her behalf, possibly to obscure the sheer volume of her acquisitions. The rat problem excuse was further undermined by neighbors who testified that the quantities purchased were far in excess of what would be required for even the most severe rodent infestation.
Legal proceedings and the precedent of State v. Gilligan.
The legal journey of Amy Archer-Gilligan consisted of two distinct trials and a landmark Supreme Court appeal. Her first trial began in June 1917, where she was initially charged with 5 counts of homicide. Through the efforts of her defense counsel, the charges were reduced to a single count for the trial, the homicide of Franklin R. Andrews. Despite the reduction in charges, the prosecution presented evidence regarding the other deaths to establish a system or pattern of behavior. The jury, deliberating for only 4 hours, found her guilty of first-degree homicide, and she was sentenced to death by hanging. Archer-Gilligan's attorneys appealed the conviction to the Connecticut Supreme Court of Errors, resulting in the 1918 decision State v. Gilligan, 92 Connecticut 126. The court overturned the conviction, ruling that the admission of evidence regarding the other 4 deaths was prejudicial and a technical error. The court's logic centered on the principle that a defendant should only be tried for the specific crime charged. Introducing uncharged misconduct, or the other poisonings, created a risk that the jury will convict her based on her bad character or propensity to kill rather than the evidence in the Andrews case specifically.
The 1919 trial and the insanity defense.
The second trial began in June of 1919. Faced with the overwhelming forensic evidence from the exhumations, the defense shifted its strategy to a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. Mary Archer, Amy's daughter, provided emotional testimony claiming that her mother was severely addicted to morphine, which had allegedly induced a state of mental instability. This strategy was partially successful. While she was again found guilty, the charge was reduced to second-degree homicide. Archer-Gilligan was sentenced to life imprisonment and was initially incarcerated at the Wethersfield prison. However, in 1924, she was declared temporarily insane by prison authorities and transferred to the Connecticut General Hospital for the Insane in Middletown. She remained institutionalized for the rest of her life, dying on April 23, 1962, at the age of 88.
Legislative reform and the evolution of oversight.
The most significant societal outcome of the Archer-Gilligan case was the realization that elder care facilities had been operating in a blind spot of the law. In the early 20th century, nursing homes were a new enterprise, and the state had no mechanism for monitoring the quality of care or the legitimacy of death certificates issued within them. The Archer home was a pioneer in a field that had outpaced the legal framework intended to protect the vulnerable. In 1917, while the first trial was still ongoing, the Connecticut state legislature took decisive action by introducing a bill to regulate old folks' homes. This legislation, which became law later that year, established the foundational requirements for the modern nursing home industry. It mandated state licensing for all facilities providing care to the elderly, regular inspections by state-appointed officials to monitor health and safety standards, mandatory annual reports of all deaths occurring on site to be submitted to the State Board of Charities. This bill was a direct attempt to prevent the hidden mortality that Archer-Gilligan had exploited. By requiring the State Board of Charities to review death reports, the legislature created a system where a surge in mortality would be flagged by a centralized authority rather than relying on the suspicion of grieving relatives and the tenacity of journalists.
Cultural significance of arsenic and old lace.
The story of the Windsor homicides achieved permanent cultural acceptance through its adaptation into the Broadway play and later the film Arsenic and Old Lace. Playwright Joseph Kesselring, who had read about the case of the boy, conducted extensive research in Connecticut, reviewing court records and interviewing the original prosecutor, Hugh Alcorn. Kesselring's play, which debuted in 1941, was a farcical black comedy that shifted the motive from Archer-Gilligan's cold-blooded greed to a misguided sense of mercy on the part of two elderly sisters. While the Brewster sisters in the play used poisoned elderberry wine to release lonely men from their suffering, the reality of the Archer home was far more sinister. The theatrical version sanitized the predatory nature of the crimes, turning a serial homicide case into a beloved piece of Americana. However, the central themes of the play, the boarding house setting, the use of arsenic and strychnine, the insanity within the family, all maintain a direct fidelity to the historical facts of the Archer-Gilligan case.
Aftermath and the 2015 Freedom of Information case.
The case of Amy Archer-Gilligan remains active in Connecticut's legal discourse even a century later. In 2015, the Connecticut Supreme Court presided over the case SC 19371, which involved a request under the Freedom of Information Act for Archer-Gilligan's medical and psychiatric records from her time at the Middletown Hospital, 1924 to 1962. The quester, Robillard, sought these records for historical research, but the hospital and the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services refused disclosure, citing doctor-patient privilege. The court ruled that even though Archer-Gilligan had been dead for over 50 years, her psychiatric and medical records were not subject to public disclosure. This decision reinforced the absolute nature of psychiatric confidentiality in Connecticut, regardless of the historical notoriety of the patient. This legal footnote underscores the enduring complexity of Archer-Gilligan's identity. She was simultaneously a convicted serial killer, a psychiatric patient, and a citizen whose privacy rights were upheld long after her death. The totality of the Archer-Gilligan investigation represents a watershed moment in the intersection of forensic science and social welfare. By exposing the murder factory in Windsor, the state of Connecticut was forced to acknowledge the inherent risk of unregulated private care. The resulting 1917 legislation and the legal precedents established in her trials continue to shape the ethical and operational standards for the protection of the elderly, ensuring that the predatory business models of the past are curtailed by institutional transparency and state-mandated accountability. That brings another episode to a close as I close the file on Amy Archer-Gilligan. Join me next time where I'll be opening the file on Roberto Arguelles.
That's my story, from my crimes to my death in the hospital.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, then smash that like and follow button. It'll help keep the series going. This is Misfit signing off, and as always, stay safe.